Don't miss psychedelic pioneer Dennis McKenna and the leading thinkers in today's psychedelic sciences at the Portland Psychedelic Conference 2018. Tickets are moving fast and will sell out. Don't miss your chance. Get your ticket today.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for coming out to this meeting of the Portland Psychedelic Society, Hacking You, the Future of Psychedelics. I'm Charles. I'm a volunteer here with the Portland Psychedelic Society. We are a volunteer-powered organization that is working to keep Portland visionary. Thank you all for coming out tonight to our presentation. Our speaker, Preston, also has a new poster that he's created for you that you are all going to want at the end of this event. So please do check it out. The t-shirts are 20, the poster is 10. All right, Preston Temple, give it up for him.
Hello, everybody. Oh, hello. So, hi, I am Preston, and I really appreciate everyone coming out here. This is only my second time in Portland, and that's kind of surprising because I really love it here. It's awesome. Kind of funny story of how I got here. Essentially, I grew up doing a lot of drugs. And as early as 3, I remember being given Ritalin. And it wasn't really a choice. Like, it wasn't like I was voluntarily just popping pills, right? I was diagnosed with ADHD at 18 months old, and they decided to start me on Ritalin at 3. And over time, the dose progressed and progressed and progressed until I reached the age of 12. And finally, I was having, like, tics and, like, neurological issues. And they took me off the medicine. I finally made friends. I finally, like, felt a little bit normal, which is strange because the Ritalin was supposed to make me normal, right? It wasn't a perfect drug. It wasn't even what I would call a very good drug. And it's part of what, that experience is part of what has led me to kind of be on a relentless search of better drugs. And this eventually turned into a desire to create better drugs and to understand how they work and how they can be made and perfected. So yeah, that's essentially what's brought me here today. So in order to talk about the future, we have to briefly go over the past. So where did we come from? We came from plants and fungus. Amanita muscaria, marijuana, psilocybin cubensis, iboga. These are the OG psychedelics. And over time, we eventually figured out to combine them together and create such classics as ayahuasca and who knows what. But so over time, we eventually figured out how to create extracts. So we came up with DMT, mescaline, ibogaine, 5-MeO-DMT, psilocybin. And that wasn't enough, so we came up with complex plant extracts, which are like LSD, MDMA, for example. Then finally, Alexander Shulgin and began creating such classics as 2CB, 4-ACO-DMT, 5-MeO-MIPT. One of my personal favorites, Bromo Dragonfly. It kind of like opened up the world of what's possible with designer drugs. So then finally, around like the 90s or so, you ended up with what they called ecstasy. And this was usually a blend of MDA with some kind of amphetamine that replicated the effects of MDMA, except it was a little longer lasting, and some would say it was better than MDMA itself. Over time, ecstasy became more of a compromise drug. So people would work with what they had and what they were able to source to create something that was kind of like MDMA or could at least be sold as such. So the two drugs I'm about to talk about are not compromise drugs. They are no compromise drugs. So Poly and Wally are two drugs which have no compromise. Poly was designed as an upgrade to MDMA, and it's a blend of 3 drugs designed to have a synergistic effect together. Typically, it's cleaner, clearer, smoother, and deeper with much fewer side effects, little to no come down, no hangover. Most people report a really pleasant afterglow in the days following. There's been about 1,300 trials or so over the last 5 years, and the last like 500 or 600 have been like overwhelmingly positive. Very few negative reports, very few even side effects. The second drug we'll talk about is Wali. Wali is designed as a deep shamanic medicine. It's a blend of 5 drugs featuring 2 dissociatives. It lasts about 8 to 12 hours, and people have compared it to like a cross between ibogaine, 5-MeO-DMT, and MDMA. And somewhere around 150 people or so have tried that one. So, what's in Poly? Poly is 3 things: 5-MAPB, which is a benzofuran analog of MDMA. It's mostly a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is important because MDMA is mostly a serotonin agonist. So if you don't know the difference, it's basically like one of them just kind of dumps your serotonin supply, the MDMA, the serotonin agonist. And 5-MAPB makes more use of what's already there. It basically allows you to get a little more juice out of what you've already got. So it's much less depleting in that sense. So this is combined with 4-ACO malt or 4-ACO-MET or 4-HO-MIPT. There's a few tryptamines, mostly 4 substituted tryptamines that will work in this formula. But 4-ACO malt, which has only come onto the scene very recently, is the cleanest, clearest, gentlest, most forgiving of them all. So less prevalence of side effects, a generally more heart-opening, warm, soft, loving experience. So what happens is the 5-MAPB, potentiates the tryptamine, the 4-ACO malt, and magnifies its effect. So you only need a very small amount of this tryptamine. You really don't need much. In fact, if you took the dose of tryptamine that's in Poly by itself, you would be pretty bored. It wouldn't do that much. But when it's combined with 5-MAPB, you have a pretty awesome experience. However, you would be couch-locked and kind of blissed out if it wasn't for the third ingredient, which is 4-fluoromethylphenidate. It's a fluorinated Ritalin analog, and it's mostly a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. So I want to talk about toxicity of MDMA versus Poly. And there's 1 to 3 ways that MDMA could be neurotoxic or cardiotoxic, depending on who you ask. This is largely speculative just due to how sparse a lot of this research has been. 2 of these theories have been popularized by David Nichols, who's considered kind of the prominent psychedelic scientist in the world today. It's like, do your research if this interests you or if this feels like it may or may not be true. So the first is neurotoxicity may occur as a result of oxidation and cell death when dopamine uptake occurs at serotonin receptor sites after the brain is depleted. So MDMA is a dopamine agonist, meaning it releases dopamine as well as releasing serotonin, as well as being a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So all of this action at serotonin means that, at the serotonin receptor, means that your brain may be depleted of serotonin towards the end of your experience. When this happens, there is, according to Dave Nichols, a good chance that your serotonin receptors will begin uptaking dopamine. This causes oxidation and cell death, and is a kind of the prominent theory on how MDMA could be neurotoxic. The second one, which is much less speculative, this is pretty factual. There have been rat studies, and it's generally agreed that cardiotoxicity may occur due to MDMA's action at the calcium channel. This mostly happens through ventricle dysfunction and just oxidative stress in the heart. So if you've ever felt like just kind of something's not quite right in there, that could be why. The third is neurotoxicity and or serotonin depletion may occur from MDMA purely due to its potency as a serotonin agonist. So yeah, your brain's going to get depleted because that's just what it does. It just dumps it all out. Now, by contrast, poly uses dopamine reuptake inhibition rather than dopamine agonism. This means there's much less likely of a chance that your serotonin receptors would begin uptaking dopamine, so less chance of oxidation and cell death. 2, 5-MAP-B very likely has much less action on the calcium channel than MDMA, if any at all. MDMA is fairly unique in its action at the calcium channel, and we don't typically see this across most other phenethylamines. So although 5-MAP-B has likely not been broadly bioassayed on a broad panel, it's very likely that it does not have the same action that MDMA does on the calcium channel. And finally, since poly is mostly a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, it's less likely to deplete you. Okay, so thanks for sciencing with me. And now I want to explain or tell a story of a basic experience report. This is just kind of a good classic, like what to expect. I was able to experience the profound healing qualities of poly as I took it in a small group setting this past week. Once ingested, its effect was smooth and regular. I was able to move past certain blocks and see patterns rather easily. I was at ease in my body, dancing and finding my own rhythm, while also able to connect beautifully with others. There was an expansion beyond my personal self, and it just felt like more of my loving, true nature was able to be expressed. A deep, deep gratitude for my life, what I am involved with, and all of life. Beautiful dancing with the universe, and while I also felt some pain of deep hurts, these were expressed and felt released with the support of others. It is aptly named, I think. It did indeed make me want to connect with others deeply and with an open heart. So this is good. This is kind of what you would expect from your average experience. Then there are some small outlying testimonials, which I'll read. It is the single greatest substance I've ever put in my body. It was the most connected I've ever felt to another human being. It unlocked my powers as a healer. Suddenly I'm able to do powerful energy work, and I can do it without the medicine. It allowed me to finally drop my sexual shame, come out as who I am, and open my heart to receive the beautiful love that was waiting for me. That's a big one. That's a big one, especially if you've been holding that back. And then one of my favorites is, we're here at Burning Man, and all anyone is talking about at our camp is poly. Poly this, poly this. Have you tried poly? I'm sick of hearing about it. We're on the playa. Let's just do Burning Man. But I mean, it's still a good testimonial, right? It's a compliment. And then finally, we've been finding that the influence of poly in our lives has been bringing so much stuff to the surface. Our relationship has been changing and evolving in ways we would have never expected. These are kind of generally what you would expect. These are some really good outlying testimonials. And then finally, I'd like to move on to Wali. So Wali is very interesting. And how it came about was my experiences with ayahuasca and my basic lack thereof. And I say this not to discourage anyone from ayahuasca, because I am probably one of the very few people, like very, very, very few, who can drink 12 cups and just not feel anything. So yeah, I sat 3 times with it, coming to it with this very specific trauma that I wanted to heal surrounding my birth. I was adopted at birth, and as such, I was taken from my mother, and I never felt wanted by her in the first place, right? But then I was never held by her. I went to these strangers who I didn't know, and this whole experience was traumatic, and it led to a lot of abandonment issues and a lot of just weird behavior that I didn't want. And as I became familiar with this issue, I decided to come to ayahuasca with it for healing. And ayahuasca did did not help me. I did not have much of an experience. And I think it's worth mentioning that in my past, I've probably had somewhere around 800 or 900 breakthrough DMT experiences. So it's possible that that has something to do with why I didn't feel ayahuasca. But nevertheless, after my experiences, I was left wanting that healing, and I began playing with combos, incorporating these two dissociatives, desichloroketamine and 2-oxo-PCE, which had come out recently, or around that time. I found a really, really profound, deep healing state that after a few sessions with it, I was able to do the healing that I wanted, achieve the healing that I wanted from ayahuasca. I was able to relive my birth and reparent myself through the birth canal, through seeing light for the first time, and tell myself that it's okay, that I am loved, this is all a part of the plan. At that point, that was the most profound healing experience of my life. What's kind of funny is that as this was happening, there was an ayahuasca ceremony in the other room, because I live with ayahuasca shamans. I was so in the next morning, I was like, hey, how y'all doing? Yeah, you get that healing? Yeah, me too. So that felt really good. So yeah, desichloroketamine is the most active ingredient in Wali. It's a very interesting substance. It's one of the few analogs that's simpler than what it's an analog of. They basically take the chlorine off the cyclohexene ring of ketamine, and they have desichloroketamine. It's much more potent, much more longer lasting, and much more psychedelic. It's also a bit more embodied and soulful. It's a very interesting, powerful substance. It might be my most favorite single molecule, which is saying something. That's above DMT, that's above LSD, that's up there. I probably tried around 80 different psychedelics, maybe 70, and 30 or 40 more stimulants and other drugs. So the second ingredient, also dissociative, analog of PCE. Then we have a benzofuran analog of MDA. This is similar to 5-MAP-B, except it's less of a serotonin agonist, less of a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, more of a classic agonist. Then 2CB-Fly kind of adds a little depth and some visual to it. I found that it added a bit to the malleability, how open I was to whatever was coming through, whatever download I was having, whatever perception I was having. And then finally, throw a little bit of the stimulant in there to make things a bit interesting. And the dopamine action will make a little bit more sense later. Come on, it looks like this is stimulating enough, right? No, this is an important piece, the dopamine action. So my favorite experience report that I've heard, there was a facilitator that did some work with this gentleman in his 40s. He says, so he had a single session with him beforehand, about 2 to 3 hours, set some intentions, decide what they were going to work on. And then their one session. After that, I finally feel like me. After 46 years on this planet, I finally feel like I belong in this life and in this skin. I finally get it. You have no idea what it's been like. 9 months later, it's been over 9 months, and I've been off antidepressants. I've never been happier. Thanks to so-and-so, today is the first day of another year that I'm thrilled to be living. That night last April was the most important night of my life. I have remained transformed. It's now been about 16 months after the single session. He is still, at that same level that he was. He feels that the change has persisted. No desire to be on antidepressants. No feeling of lack in his life. So yeah, that was a good one. Other experience reports, some would say it was like 10 hours of pure enlightenment. It feels like an ascended state. Better than toads, says the toad shaman. Peak psychedelic experience, says 100-plus trip ayahuascaran. brought me out of what felt like a hopeless depression in only the first few hours, then gave me one of the most profoundly deep healing experiences of my life, 6 to 7 hours in. I've experienced 3 births so far, my birth, the birth of my child, and this. And finally, it has been the most psychedelic, heart-opening, slate-cleaning experience to date. And it's worth mentioning that most of these people, even the people who aren't these two, are very experienced. Pretty much no one who isn't really very experienced finds themselves having this experience. It requires an advanced user, I'll say. And there's one other really funny story. So I'm not going to name names, and I'm not going to name the book, but one of my favorite stories is a friend of mine ended up taking the medicine with 2 other friends. And one of them was being really annoying, just annoying everyone, like kind of in his head, like couldn't really drop in with the group. Everyone's trying to like have their own experience, and he's like, "Hey guys, hey, what's going on? Let's talk." And so to try to placate him, my friend gave him a pen and said, "Here, go write some stuff down." So he starts writing. He happens to be a pretty brilliant guy. He wrote about 5 pages or so, and it ended up being this kind of manifesto. After about 1.5 years or so, he had turned this 5 pages into 400 pages, and it ended up being a book, which got published, and it was the #1 bestseller on Amazon for at least 20 weeks. It's interesting what can happen. And it's not all good at all. Some people have really terrible experiences, just awful. There's one example of a father. This first example is a father and a daughter who were trying to heal some deep trauma from the past. And they're in this experience and they're purging all over each other and they're apologizing to one another. And then the father gets on all 4s and starts growling and roaring and channeling this lion spirit. And that lasted about 2 hours. Then they both had headaches and felt terrible for the rest of the day. Didn't really feel good for like a couple days. But the shaman did say that there did appear to be some powerful healing. They affectionately refer to it as Drano. Another experience report, I literally hugged the toilet for over 6 hours, just dry retching, praying for it to be over. But it wasn't done for over 24 hours. My partner enjoyed it though, and it felt good to have him be there for me through what felt like hell. I had head and body aches that lasted for days. It's worth mentioning that she did not eat for 16 hours before her experience, and that is most likely related just because the body needs some fortification if you're going to be like doing this all-night thing, right? And then finally, this is my favorite, and I have no explanation for this. Best psychedelic state I've ever experienced, hands down. But then I lost the use of my right hand and spent thousands of dollars in a few weeks getting it back. I don't know why that happened, but some kind of like energy like moving into her hand, I don't know. But she's fine now, everything's great. And there's been no reports of anything remotely like that since. So, weird. So, like, this is a bit of a tangent, but why does it suck so much for some people? Like, that's kind of weird. And my answer, it's taken me a while to come up with a hypothesis, but my hypothesis is that it's most likely a combination of a weak expression of several genes in the P450 enzyme series, specifically CYP2B6, possibly 3A4, maybe some 2D6 and 2C9. So what are those, you might ask? Well, on the subject of drug metabolism, I'd like to introduce to you the cytochrome P450 enzymes brought to you by your cytochrome P450 genes. Basically, these are this collection of enzymes that are produced by these genes, and they each break down different what's called substrates or drugs. There's about a dozen of these enzymes that are responsible for breaking down over 70 to 80% of all drugs, at least the ones that we're aware of, right? different enzymes will produce different metabolites from the same drug. So take the same drug, different enzymes will produce different drugs, different metabolites from it. The same enzyme can also produce different metabolites from the same drug. So there's a ton of variance here. And then on top of that, some of these enzymes work together to break down different parts of the same drug. So if you imagine a molecule as like a building, right? It's not all made of the same stuff. It's not like this building is made of wood and glass and metal and some plastic and just all kinds of things. If you were to break it down, not just knock it down, but break it down, decompose it, you would need different strategies for each material. And this is why there are different enzymes often for different parts of a drug. So what happens is as this drug is being broken down, it gets broken down into metabolites that may or may not be slightly more or slightly less potent, slightly more or slightly less toxic, or have slightly different effects. So you never really know what you're going to get as you're metabolizing a drug. This turns out to be especially true for dissociatives, specifically PCP and often ketamine. What I believe and what I've read, what may be going on here is a shortage of CYP2B6. This particular gene is rare. So here's a basic breakdown of the different enzymes and how what role they have in breaking down, how do I put this? What percentage of drugs are broken down by which enzyme? So 3A4 is the most common, followed by 2D6. 2D6 breaks down most classic psychedelics, and most people have no shortage of it. But even if they do, 3A4 and 2C8 can do some of the work that 2D6 can't. But then you get down to CYP2B6, and it only breaks down about 3% of drugs, and it's not very prevalent. As you can imagine, if that's your workload, if you only have 3% of the load, there doesn't need to be that much of you, right? So it's not very common, or it's not highly populated in the liver. And some people are missing it entirely. So for those people, it's very likely. So for those people, a dissociative experience can go from lasting about 3 hours to lasting upwards of 36 hours. And I thought that sounded really extreme. I thought 36 hours, holy shit. Until I spoke to two people, one of which did a bump of ketamine and was tripping for 2 months. Yeah. So I'm paying for his 23andMe, and I'm going to figure out what's going on. How is that possible? Because he knows another woman who also did a little bit of K, tripped for 3 weeks. So yeah, there's some really interesting stuff going on here. And a little bit of water there, sorry. So this leads me to a theory, which is that I wonder if the frequency with which we encounter certain drugs over the course of our evolution may have a bearing on the prevalence of the enzymes that break those drugs down. So in other words, if I keep encountering, okay, so here's an analogy, tangent. So when trees came about in evolution, in biology, the evolution of our Earth, fungus did not initially know how to break it down. Fungus was not sure how to break down cellulose, just glucose. Glucose is easy, but cellulose was a little more complicated. And so over time, trees and this biomass of them began to just build up in our Earth and build up until finally the fungus figured out how to break it down. In that time, it altered our atmosphere. There was so many trees around, and the mushrooms could do nothing about it until finally they figured out how to just blast oxygen at it until they oxidize it and convert the cellulose into glucose and then break it down from there. So a similar thing may happen to our evolution when we encounter new drugs. For example, the aerocyclohexylamine class, which is all dissociatives. It's very likely that we have not yet evolved the appropriate number of enzymes to break down those drugs. So some people are just missing it altogether. That's my theory. That's my idea. Yeah, okay. So thanks for going on this lovely tangent for me. I hope you enjoyed it. And now let's talk about what's next. So if Polly and Wally already exist, sound pretty great for the most part, what is on the horizon? So Sasha Shulgin said, I'm looking for tools that can be used for studying the mind, and other people will use the tools in finding out the aspects of the mental process and how it ties to the brain. So Sasha Shulgin said this, and I believe that who he was talking about is Dr. Thomas Ray. So Thomas Ray challenged the predominant paradigm of psychedelic science and the misconception around serotonin 2. He worked with Shulgin and Nichols to have 25 drugs bioassayed for their affinity at a broad range of receptors. And I'm going to show you these drugs now. These drugs were selected by himself and Alexander Shulgin and Dave Nichols. And they represent kind of the basic, like, a really basic academic toolkit of what's out there. So when he bioassayed them, he found, and this is obviously just a few, he found this. Instead of just serotonin 2, he found all of these other receptors which were previously disregarded by psychedelic science. So let's talk about those. Well, first there is serotonin 1. Serotonin 1 activates cognition, language, logic, reason. It's basically like your rationale. If you think about Socrates and the kind of the age of knowledge, of information, and enlightenment, this was likely inspired by a blooming of this receptor. Then there is imidazoline, which is the strongest hit for MDMA. So yeah, it's been misunderstood for a long time that MDMA, that the active thing is serotonin. Yes, it's a crucial ingredient, but the really active ingredient is imidazoline, and it creates feelings of ecstasy, empathy, openness, compassion, peace, acceptance, etc., etc. This is what allows people to release their trauma, and this is what allows people to feel their feelings and forgive those who have wronged them and forgive themselves. Then there's beta 2, which has most likely not been experienced by most people. There aren't very many beta 2 drugs, but it gives you a feeling of exuberance, a joy of life, a joy of living, a sense of home, family, community, and just kind of that feeling of like everything's good, like this radiant sense of joy. Then there's alpha 2. This is the essence of the world around us, the wetness and fluidity of water, the hardness and durability of rock, what you would call a rasa. This is the essence of ourselves and the events and experiences that shape our lives and form who we are. Then we have alpha 1. This gives you a sense of the flow of events from the past through the present and into the future, a sense of a timeline and a sense of history, of events unfolding and liveliness, of vitality of a scene. Then we have histamine. So this is a really interesting one. It gives you a sense of an other. It's how I am able to perceive all of you, and it's how you all are able to perceive me. Because you're not directly experiencing me, you're experiencing your concept of me, which you have constructed in your head based on what you see and what your senses are telling you, right? And this is what Thomas would call the mental organ that allows you to experience that. So this is like your mother's voice in your head, that sense of knowing what someone will say before they say it, or even a vision or encounter with a deceased loved one. Then we have dopamine. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Dopamine adds a sense of profundity, a sense of meaning and knowing and significance and certainty. It can combine with a sense of awe and uncritical certainty, often provoking a religious experience. It is most likely this receptor which is responsible for the positive results of the Good Friday experiment. If you heard of the experiment where some people in the, I don't know if it was the priesthood, but religious devotees were given psilocybin mushrooms, and many of them ranked it above as the most profound experience of their life. They took it during Mass, and many of them had religious experiences. So finally, we come to Sigma, and this is probably my favorite one because it is, let me check on my time. This is probably my favorite one because it is the most active one in decichloroketamine, and also ketamine. It's present in DMT and also ibogaine. It's a very important player in ibogaine. And this is kind of like a premortal awareness, like this is almost like your id, I would say. It's uncivilized, selfish, hedonistic, and emotional. It's pure, it's innocent, it's beyond judgment, honest and uncorrupted. It's very sensitive, and it needs the protection of the ego. It can't be exposed. It's also likely the root of somatic memory. Interestingly, the sigma receptors effectively define and modulate the limbic system. The limbic system is found all along the back of your spine and along your nerves, and it regulates emotion, behavior, instincts, motivation, learning, and long-term somatic memory. It very well may be the source of psychosomatic pain. Not only that, possibly the pain from autoimmune disease and possibly addiction withdrawal comes from sigma. The reason for this hypothesis is the incredible ability of ibogaine to relieve addicts of their withdrawal pains. Like that's amazing. Like it's able to allow a heroin addict to get clean without experiencing the pain of withdrawal. It takes that pain away. And we believe that is rooted, or that at least sigma is a crucial part of that effect. I personally believe it's a combination of sigma along with kappa and mu. I think those three, and serotonin. I think when those three are combined, it has this effect. Finally, we have serotonin 7, which I'm running out of time here, but serotonin 7 is kind of like a flavor enhancer. It's kind of like the MSG of psychedelics. It makes everything a little bit better, but not toxic like MSG. It takes things to a higher level, knocks it up a notch, turns the dial up to 11. This is what's most active in DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, LSD, psilocin. It's what makes it, it's what like brings the aliens out, let's say. It can get really weird at high doses of this one. And then finally there's serotonin 2, which we discussed this earlier, but serotonin 2 is basically the gatekeeper of consciousness and allows other receptors to come into consciousness and be fully felt. It really has no flavor of its own, it's just a carrier. So, putting it all into perspective, this is what we've got. And there's also this down here, which I would love to talk about if I had more time, but we can maybe talk about that later. This is the poster I have right there. And this is the Polydrug Starter Toolkit, aka the primer probe technique. This is essentially a toolkit that we've assembled to recreate psychedelic states and with great precision. So we're able to combine one or more of these with one of these and craft a custom designer psychedelic state. Because that's what we want. We want designer states. And essentially, if you want to go back in time and speak to your dead mother and forgive her for some whatever she did, then we want to be able to very intentionally create that experience. Versus currently what we have is more of a shotgun approach. Like, it might work and it might not. So we want to be able to create those experiences more reliably, more precisely. Yeah, I feel that there will be tremendous healing with that. I don't have time to talk about that. So an important point I wanted to make. Okay, cool. So important point I want to make on this is that the drug is not necessarily the teacher. There's this way that I feel that we may be giving our power away by saying, oh, LSD changed my life. DMT just opened my... Yes, but no. It was the key that opened the door within your own mind. And what you found within there, that was yours. That was you. That was not the drug. So give yourself credit. Don't give your power away to these molecules. Yeah. You are the teacher. So, our next steps are to bioassay more drugs so their states can be reverse engineered and understood. Identify more receptors that can be brought into consciousness, because right now we're only working with like 8. And there's many subunits and many other receptors that we don't know if they have effects or what effects they may have. And finally, build out our toolkit, this little guy that you see here. Build this out so we can just go crazy, but not literally. And also find some pure serotonin 7 agonists, because right now we're missing that. So to have that little flavor enhancer would really, really make the toolkit a lot more robust. And then finally, develop new novel states along with therapeutic protocols for various forms of psychological trauma. So, go grab a poster, and I only have about 25 of them, so get them before they're gone. Now there's Q&A time, and then, should I do the Q&A? And then show that. Cool. So, thank you.
Give it up for Preston.
Thank you, Preston. This is wonderful.
Yeah.
I would like to know about the 23andMe and how each of us might use that to help us understand our individual metabolism.
That's a very good question. At first, I thought it would be as simple as looking at the expression of CYP2B6, but then as I looked through it, that does not seem to be directly correlated. So it may be a bit more multifaceted than I had originally thought. But my plan is to create an app, a little web app using the 23andMe API, and then figure out what everyone's expression of these particular genes are and see if there's a correlation. The thing is that you have to try a drug like desichloroketamine or ketamine or DXM and then know what your metabolism is, like know the rate that you metabolize it. So it's partially anecdotal and partially scientific. It's a tricky thing. What I'm looking for right now is people who have already had outlyingly long experiences on a dissociative. So I'm not looking to like get a bunch of people high and be like, how long did it last? Because that's a little dangerous and weird. But if you've had a very long, if you've had a very long experience, then I want to study you and figure out what's happening with your genes.
More questions on this side? Any questions over here? Over here?
Thank you. That was a great presentation. Which of these substances are presently legal?
In Poly and Wally, all of them. Not for 5-MAP-B and not for 5-APB and APDB. And not really for 2-oxo-PCE, but kind of. But especially, not really for 2-CB-Fly, but especially and absolutely definitely not for 5-MAP-B. It's still a gray area, but nothing in Poly or Wally is illegal. They're all legal research chemicals. When they do become illegal is when they are sold for the purpose of consumption. So that's why it's a gray area. So even though the individual constituents are perfectly legal and legal to be sold, bought and sold, they are not legal to be sold for consumption, which is what makes this still very much a gray area.
Since poly isn't a serotonin agonist, does that mean that it doesn't interfere with SSRIs, SNRIs? Or?
It is an agonist. It's just not a very strong one. And there is an interaction. There is an interaction. I advise anyone who is on SSRIs just not to take it. I err on the side of caution.
More questions out here? Yeah.
Thank you. Could you elaborate on what is the intended purpose of this poster that you're doing, and what would be the best way for us to utilize it for our advantage?
Good question. So this is kind of a synthesis of Thomas Ray's. So this is kind of a synthesis of Thomas Ray's work. He is remarkably brilliant, and his work is probably some of the most important work that's ever been done in the history of psychedelics. And there's a lot going on. It's difficult to understand. So my hope with this was to be able to synthesize it in a way that is digestible. I realize it's very busy and there's still a lot going on, but if you spend time with it and you read it from the introduction all the way through, then it does paint a fairly illustrative picture of his work.
Just to follow up with that, do you have any kind of web presence? This is me. Any place I can purchase a poster online? You used the word our research on this. Who else is involved? Are you affiliated with any institution, or can you speak more to your background or anything like that?
It's myself. So it's myself and Thomas Ray. I don't have any direct background in this. I'm really a hacker who loves to learn and loves to research and loves psychedelics. So all of this is just, thank you. So all of this is just my own self-directed research. I have been learning a tremendous amount about psychopharmacology through Thomas Ray. He teaches at Oklahoma State University, which is odd, right? But that's where he teaches. So we're currently trying to enlist more institutions to help support this research.
Are there any other questions out here?
Have you ever tried to do DNA testing on a person and see if it matches up with these different cocktails, or can you make them to fit one person instead of a general?
Do you mean based on their enzyme, their gene expression?
Yeah. You said there's some people break down different.
Well, that's where I'm hoping it's eventually headed. It hasn't been necessary in the past, but now that we're incorporating dissociatives into healing modalities, it's kind of important. I have a friend who runs a ketamine clinic and says that occasionally people come in and then they feel very sick and very ill and not good afterwards. and currently they don't exactly know why. But my hope is to kind of build a network with these clinics, and then hopefully gain access to their outlier cases of people who have negative experiences, and then be able to figure out what's going on and like what are the commonalities. Currently, that's about it.
We have time for about 2 more questions. We got one here on the stage.
With the way that ayahuasca is a cocktail and the way that we've progressed to like synthesizing substances and then making cocktails out of them, such as Wally, like what do you think the next step is, and do you think it's electronic of sorts, or what's your take on that?
That's outside of my personal, like, I'm interested in that, and I'm sure it will be some kind of neuronal stimulation, but I've been focusing on chemicals. So for me, the next step is incorporating these guys. Essentially, what I'm trying to do is build out this toolkit and be able to create kind of designer therapeutic states to allow people to heal in whatever way is necessary. It's going to take a lot of experimentation and a lot of research and development of new drugs. But yeah, ultimately, I don't know the answer to your specific question.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and it's right here.
So, to your last point, earlier you made the point that it's not the drug, it's the mindset of the person who's using it, or
right.
the mental composition of the person who's using it. But then, that makes perfect sense to me. I'm not questioning that. But then to attempt to design a drug that, it seems to me that the drug is basically unlocking, as you put it, unlocking the tendencies the person already has. So is it really that specific a designation that you attempt to reach? Does that make sense? I don't know.
I believe so. The thing is that it's unlocking different facets of ourself. So these are all different aspects or different facets of who we are. It's still us, no matter what. It's all inside of here, but it's like shining a flashlight in different parts of a room. You're going to see different stuff. So, but it's all in the same room. Does that make sense? Cool.
Can you advance to the previous slide? Cool. Yeah. All right, everybody, give it up for Preston Temple.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then coming up in October, we've got a one-day conference with Dennis McKenna and more. We are currently open for sponsorships for both the Stamets and McKenna events. So if you've got a business that would like to support our community, a dispensary, a glass store, a naturopath, anything like that, we are currently looking for sponsors. Let's keep Portland visionary.